Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I'm joined as always by my special guest, The Highway, which this morning is in Navidad edition. There's been a lot of party-going buses coming by, as well as the usual roaring motorcycles. So hopefully you get a little tiny snatch of Colombian Christmas in the background. Fingers crossed. I'm also coming to you from a new used computer, which is great. I updated a laptop that has just been struggling for pretty much as long as I've had it. And I also have new and improved internet. Yes. So the upload speed is also improving workflow. I wanted to mention this first as a point of gratitude, obviously, because this year has been a bit of a struggle, I think, well, that's an understatement. We'll get back to that. But in the process of changing technology in particular, I realized how much of my stress and my sense of competency was shaped by my environment. And I really want to take a moment to highlight how important that is to remember. For the last few years, I have had to throw a lot of things at the wall to see what sticks. I have tried to lean into project after project after project, and they just don't always work out. Things fall apart. You try to join initiatives and the initiative doesn't work. And people always say, oh my goodness, you're always working so much and so hard. It's like, no, I'm trying to keep six or eight projects on the go at all times so that something in any given month might pan out and help. But it's not an ideal way to live, and anybody who idealizes that needs a stern talking to. It is a way of coping, but it's not a way of thriving. It also is a way of living that inherently makes you incompetent to some extent. You are never going to be perfect at everything. You are always going to make mistakes, and then you're going to be frustrated with yourself about those mistakes because you can't afford a mistake. You can't afford to have screwed up. You can't afford to have been, so stupid to make just a ridiculous oversight. How could I have not thought of that? It weighs on you, and it weighs on a lot of people. Me, I'm part of a selection of the human species that did not have the most loving upbringing, and so it hits me in a lot of the habituated feels. When I was younger, you were not allowed to make a mistake. It would be held against you. It would come back to you years after the fact. Statements like, well, I knew you weren't going to succeed at that because when you were 10, ... story about when you were a child and did something that a child does. That's one extreme framework. Not everybody has that. Many people did grow up in more loving homes as children. And yet they'll still conflate environmental factors with what they're actually capable of as human beings. If we are stressed out, if we don't have a path to security, if there is a lack of purpose-driven work in our lives, if we don't feel like we're integrated well to our surrounding networks and don't see any pathway forward, if our technology is not the strongest, we are going to be scrambling. And in a scrambling mode, we're going to blame ourselves. I am just a messy, scrambly person who just screws up all the time and makes mistakes. It's not a healthy way to live. But it's just important to remember that as much as we love our sense of self, the idea that we are strict individuals, we are always informed by our context. And in the last few years especially, our context has been filled with a lot of overt pain, and in ways that are clear to everyone. Now, I want to be very clear as I say this. I'm talking as a generalized shift in our awareness of overt cruelty. Many marginalized groups have been fully aware of it, and yet there's been this weird shared experience in the last few years that's been difficult for us to deal with. It's shared and it's not shared. Our response to it is different, but we are undergoing similar pressure points. So the precarity that we're living in manifests through pandemic and the way that governments responded to it in a way that highlighted how much they could have been responding to things differently before, but didn't. Followed by almost immediately Russia's invasion of Ukraine, really ending the first major wave of pandemic and entering this new era of imperialist conquest with a tremendous number of reminders that all of our great international fail-safes just aren't good enough, that we can't put down embargoes, that we can't magically use economic pressures and sanctions to fix this. And we also saw profound displacement rates and disparity in displacement, because the 4.5 million externally displaced Ukrainians within the first few weeks found safe harbor at a rate that was much higher and much more openly generous than has been experienced by a lot of people fleeing trauma and war and all kinds of deprivation in other parts of the world, and who are still struggling and being stigmatized as they struggle to find a place where they and their families can grow. So that was the second wave. And then we had October 7, and we had the world that came out of October 7 with a profound moral failure. Full stop. Around that profound moral failure and the realization that our systems are not created or affected in a way that allows us to enact our humanitarianism in the way that we know we need to, is devastating unto itself. Added in all of the disinformation, all of the manipulation, intentionally dehumanizing other human beings. Tremendous pain from that too. But at its core, there is a division between us. I don't usually like to speak in binaries, but this is an important binary. When one finds out or is made to realize that something about their nation state, their social contract, their sense of identity is complicit in something wrong, we have two choices, really. We can embrace correction as part of how we maintain a sense of pride in our sense of identity. Or we can view any correction as a threat to the entire brand that needs to be shut down completely. And we have very painful schisms between people who are not prepared for criticism, who are not prepared to see criticism as an important part of democratic practice and of building better societies. You have to be able to accept that you have failed to some extent, or that there has been failure to some extent, to move forward. But when people are so terrified of any kind of dissent because they see it as the ruin of everything, they will batten down those hatches and defend that identity over and above human life, over and above compassion for fellow human beings, over and above thinking about how they could possibly change and grow to meet the challenges of the new age. So more than anything right now, I do see one of the biggest pains is not just the amount of trauma in our general environment, everything from socioeconomic precarity, uncertainty caused by mass migrations that are increasing because climate change is creating more environmental pressures and more resource wars, right up to overt atrocity, right up to people slaughtering other people, and you having to endure justifications for it that make no sense, because there's no justification for the traumas that we are experiencing in the world. And it's very painful to hear people waste time trying to justify them. On top of all of that, recognizing that many of our fellow human beings are not suited to handle dissent. They can't hold in tension the idea that maybe parts of their social contract are wrong, parts of their social contract need reform. They are terrified that if they give an inch, they will lose their identity entirely. And when you have that kind of zero-sum absolutism, it's very difficult to go forward. So a lot of us are more open to dissent, and maybe it's because we've come through more harder versions of it, like constantly thinking yourself a failure every time you make a tiny mistake because you're so stressed out, because you've been working on many different projects for years to try to make a living and nothing's worked, and sometimes people venerate you. Wow, it's so amazing that you can do all these things. Look at you, independent worker, and you're just scrambling to hold on to one independent rock after the other during a landslide. You're just trying to get to the top of the hill again, or not to the top, but at least to some kind of safe plateau. We are living in a lot of chaos. We have to have grace for each other and the ability to hold things in tension, and the ability to teach other people to hold things in tension, to let them know that they can let go of an absolutist notion of an identity and not lose everything, and that we can have conversations around what our social contracts are supposed to look like or should look like, or what we want them to look like going forward. It's hard, but that's also why speculative fiction ostensibly is a really good space to put these anxieties. It's a good space to talk about it. So with that, we've now spent about 10 minutes talking about real life, so let's move on to a version of real life, the manifestations that we use all kinds of other media to create as a way of extending from our own world, because our own vocabularies are sometimes too painful. So we create animated features, we create fictional settings, we do what we need to in order to create spaces where it's safer to have these conversations. One of those is the wild robot, which I do not like. So I'm going to be very clear about that. I thought it was meh. I thought I was just in this point of feeling, okay, it's a film, but I couldn't let go of it after watching it. So I realized at a point that it wasn't just meh, it bothers me. This film got a lot of great reviews. A lot of people think it's a heartwarming found family tale, and that's great. Awesome. That's why I was meh on it at first, instead of just really wanting to dig down into some criticism, because it seems to have served a need. And it certainly allows for about an hour and 40 minutes of view time, family-friendly viewing, great. But I obviously, as a sci-fi writer, am aware of the fact that the vast majority of our stories engage in the intersection between this holy trifecta of the human as a sentient being, non-human animal sentience or non-human biological sentience, and then artificial sentience. And the tension between these three make for a lot of our stories. So there have been quite a few pieces that explore different interactions. And I'm also going to say two things to just frame what's going to obviously be my bias to some extent. One, I did not watch this film in English. It's important to remember the difference that creates. People who watch this film in English are going to have the benefit of some beloved voice actors. I watched a Spanish dub version because I'm here in Colombia, and I watched it with a friend who doesn't speak a word of English, so we watched it in Spanish. And that means I don't get any of the affective relationships, the past associations that can sometimes make a film seem a little bit better than it is or elevate its quality just because you love the voice actors. And the other aspect is that, of course, I have my own beloved favorites in this general use of the trope, one of which is the classic The Iron Giant, 1999 by Brad Bird. And we'll talk a little bit about the backstory to The Iron Giant, but I didn't know the backstory to The Iron Giant when I first watched it. And nonetheless, it will make me weep. It is a film that got me at the right point. So I do have a different childhood. This one might be the version of The Iron Giant for someone else today. Great, cool. I just want to be mindful of those generational issues and the language issues and how they inform our appreciation for a given work of fiction. But I'm also going to talk about The Wild Robot, the book. I'm also going to talk about another series that I guess now we can consider it a series, a franchise of sorts, that deals with similar themes, to frame this conversation about how this use of the trope has some very tricky elements tied in. Let's talk a little bit about The Iron Giant first. I'm going to spoil it for you. The Iron Giant, and I mean, you can stop this at any time. You're free to live your life. The Iron Giant has a machine come down to Earth that is a weapon. It is a weapon of war. And at the same time, it's also constructed in a fairly humanoid form. And it connects with a human, a young child, and that friendship allows the robot to think about resisting its programming as much as it's capable of doing so. So there is a lot built into that concept. It's a simple concept, well told, and yet you might be surprised to know how different its origin is, because a poet named Sylvia Plath died in 1963, killed herself. And the husband, Ted Hughes, was a poet in his own right, and they had children. And the story behind the creation of the book that led to the movie is that he started telling stories, these fantastical stories of this giant who came to Earth, and there's a dragon in that version. There was no dragon in my version of The Iron Giant, but he and the boy fight a dragon. I guess in this case you could say it's more of a metaphorical dragon. But he created these stories. The mythology goes, well, I'm not going to say mythology, but I'm going to say it's always partly true, like to help his children grieve. And so he told stories and he built a world around them. I imagine it was part of the grief, but I imagine that people are complex and there are more factors involved. So he accumulated the 5 general stories that he wrote into The Iron Man, which was published in 1968. And it really struck the hearts of a lot of people, including one important person, a musician, Pete Townsend. And Pete Townsend wanted to do a musical, but it didn't get off the ground. That happens sometimes. Nonetheless, he did help to get this piece to Hollywood, in the sense that he helped pitch it. I think the famous pitch that he used was, imagine if a gun had a soul, which is just a beautiful essentializing of a lovely concept. In the meantime, Ted Hughes also, his book originally was about a lot of the violence that we do to one another. And yet, and this is important to our analysis of The Wild Robot, he also then followed it up with a book using the robot as a metaphor to talk about, and as a trope to talk about our attacks on the environment. The problem, as we'll get to as it ties into our film, is that he called that the Iron Woman. So the idea of like an angry female spirit fighting back against masculine society for having ruined the land was the follow-up. So there's a lot of gender coding that comes into those stories. But with Pete Townsend, I think he was his producer ultimately. Brad Bird created The Iron Giant. It was a flop in theaters when it first came out, but it became almost an instant classic. So it was just bad timing. I think Brad Bird talked about the fact that the scheduling of the film had a lot to do, like it was set up to fail in some ways. There wasn't enough promotion. So that happens sometimes. But a really lovely piece with complicated human characters. I want to be very clear about that. This is one of the big transitions we've had with animated versions of science fiction in the last while, is that there's been an aversion to a lot of the human forms. Not always. We do get things like Inside Out. But when trying to talk about some serious issues, there's now often a deferral to animality. And I also just saw Mufasa, which is another film that is extremely selective in its use of animality. The lions, they don't really obviously act like lions because this is more of a Shakespearean plot, and it's the backstory about Mufasa and how Mufasa came to take control of Pride Rock. Actually, how Pride Rock even came to exist, it's taken care of in this film. How Scar came to be, why the brothers have the relationship they do. A lot of stuff is really well done. In that film, though, there's also a huge commentary about outsiders, which you can see is like, yep, they're using this film to talk about something important for our day and age. And so that one, I think, is a little more effective at talking about outsiders because it has dangerous outsiders and it has not so dangerous outsiders. And it has nuance there. But it's very clearly trying to talk about something in our world, and it's using animality as a safe space for the conversation. Which leads us again to The Wild Robot. And the bigger commentary that I want to make is also going to be a defense of middle grade and YA books, in this case middle grade reads, because boy howdy, middle grade reads are so courageous. And if you haven't read a lot of middle grade fiction recently, or even the last 10, 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, more can be done in the middle grade demographic than is often even done in the YA demographic. Once you get into the YA demographic, there's a lot of shifting towards pseudo-romance or proto-romance stories, and then at the same time, these grand extremes about trying to save the entire universe and only this young motley crew can do it, etc. Middle grade is much more ambitious, and it sits with some really tough ideas because its age range is children who are just coming into a sense of mortality, a sense of anxiety, self-consciousness, as they are moving through a delicate period when studies show this as well. Parents are important, but they become less important in relation to a peer group. Like in terms of youth listening to their peers and absorbing things more from their peers, there's just this new body of social contracts that children are working out. and the work that is done for them. Like, just, we have an amazing body of authors. So this criticism of the film does not extend to the book. I want to be very clear. The book does a great job of creating a kind of dispassionate, objective look. Oh, okay, actually, no, I don't like either of those words. It creates a dispassionate lens through which to view the natural world, because the robot, Ross, our main character, is observing what's happening around them. And what's around them is often very cruel, because nature is cruel. The author of the book lived, I think, in a remote cabin for a little bit, the way that we all want to, away from people sometimes. And so he himself drew from a lot of his personal exposures to the beauty, the majesty, and the hardship, the trauma of the natural world. And so this piece is a very frank engagement with that work. It's not quite the same as giving a child My Side of the Mountain or Hatchet, but it definitely is in the same wheelhouse of truly recognizing and honoring the fact that children are observant and they can see that things are cruel and hard in the natural world as well. And so there is kindness in this book, but not to the same level as the movie enforces. The movie does something very odd to try to get its point across. And we'll get to that in a second. But I just want to emphasize that in the book, it is more than possible to create a story that is aware of cruelty and doesn't try to magic it away in order to achieve a very harmonious sense of balance. Things happen differently in the book, obviously, as in the movie. The movie takes some more dramatic extremes. It has a wild range of introduced characters, but introduced stakes that don't exist in the book. So if you're looking for something for your children and you see this movie, don't let the movie be the guide for what happens in the book. The books are wonderful and thought-provoking for children. And when I say for children, again, middle grade can sometimes be very fearless. I had the same commentary this year about Star Trek Prodigy, which I think is honestly one of the best of the new Trek shows, because it writes maturely for children, and because it writes maturely for children, it ends up being a really good story for adults too. So we'll have to talk more about middle grade, because obviously it brought up some feelings for me. The Wild Robot, the film, has Roz, our robot, who was part of a shipment that was supposed to be for some other project for humanity in a near future where climate change has very much impacted and transformed a lot of our settings. But instead, this robot gets dumped on an isolated bit of wilderness with a lot of animality that reminds you of Canada, should remind you of Canada, for good reason. I guess maybe some people in the United States could say that there's an Alaskan theme as well too, but some of these creatures are definitely more well known within the Canadian environment. And in this version, Roz is not discovered by a pack of otters and reassembled and guided by animality. Roz comes awake and discovers that nobody around them can really recognize what their function is or talk to them, so they have to sit down and absorb and learn things about the natural world until they can better understand their possible client. And even then, they go around asking, is there a job, is there something they can do? And nobody in this wilderness really engages them, wants to engage with them. They're just this terrifying menace. But in the course of then trying to get themselves back to their main distributor by using they've got a transponder that should allow them to signal for help, but it gets damaged. In the course of this chaos, they themselves damage and destroy a nest and a whole family of a bird species, and there's one egg that survives, and then it becomes their task, because they've done this damage, to repair damage as best they can. They're going to take care of this egg, which very quickly hatches, becomes our other main protagonist, Brightbill. But Brightbill has been left alone, no family, no one to teach him how to fly and to swim and to eat, so he needs help. And so the task list is kind of conventional, but our robot Roz takes it on. In the process, a lot of other animal creatures end up helping. One of them, Fink, is a fox who initially just wants to eat the egg, but gains a sense of, I guess, pity at first, and then real care for the two of them while trying to teach Roz to help the little chick, Brightbill. And then there are others, Longneck and so forth, that support gradually, eventually, this family, in part because Roz also starts to do things that really do help the people, the animals around them. So build shelter when there's a terrible storm, and then teaches them to sort of live in peace, assists with other tasks that slowly improve their overall sense of connection to the community. But then there's the transponder eventually comes through, and there's an army that comes to recollect this robot, this drastic scene trying to fight to protect their home, and they do eventually leave at the end and to save their family. So the film has some connections with the book, but one of the biggest differences is how much it drills home the idea of overcoming your programming. And this is important because all the animals need to work together. They need to come together as one if they're going to handle threats caused by humanity. So there's this tie-in, the idea of the rest of nature is going to have to come together because human-caused climate change is creating so many pressure points. They don't know everything about, obviously, climate change. They just know that their world has these bizarre interactions with humanity every now and then, and that there are these extreme weather events, and to survive they're going to need to find new ways of being. Two problems, is that, as with the Iron Woman, the wild robot is strongly gendered in terms of this motherly role. So Roz becomes mother to this chick, to this baby goose. We're going to talk a little bit about what kind of goose in a second. But Roz emphasizes the idea of overcoming one's programming and going beyond one's programming. Roz doesn't really go beyond their programming. As much as that is the main point of the film, is that this robot has become more of a caregiver, more of a family member, has learned to move beyond the original program. There's an artificial element added into this because the original programming was for this one to be a servant character, to serve others, to help others. It just happens to be that the way that Roz needs to help others is a little bit different because the environment is a little different. So she has to learn how to help a chick grow into a successful goose. I'm sorry, I keep saying the chick, but Gosling. To grow into a reliable goose who can fly and who can get themselves to safe harbor for winter. But it's still a manifestation and extension of her, and I'm going to now say her because of the gendering that has been put into this film, her original task list. At the same time, none of the other animals acts really the way that they're supposed to in this context. There's a lot of manipulation of animal behavior for most of these kinds of films, but it really comes out here because of that heavy-handed message that they all need to overcome their programming. Not always easy to do when, some creatures are actually carnivores. Like some people, the idea of people, which is what's being tied in here, is people need to come together to defend against climate change. People need to come together to defend against all these hardships that are being inflicted upon them. That's fair. And if this was just people, that would be great. This would be much easier. But the way that this film affects its sense of community is more so than the book. In terms of the book has a little bit more of realism built in. This very heavy-handed coming together, all the animals working as one in this fight against this great threat. By continuing to push back, it's going above your programming. The idea of that base programming not already including, when it comes to animality, some sense of animals having an understanding of when to fight, when to feed, and when to just try to coexist is frustrating, because most of those animals, and we've seen this all the time in videos, animality already includes more than that sort of cutthroat, reductive notion of programming. It's human beings who created a very arbitrary notion of reductive dog-eat-dog programming. It's even in the way that we've said that, like we just appropriate animality. But actual nature already has a lot of those balances worked in. You can see that animals do, in certain circumstances, come together in shelter and work in collaborative ways. So this film creates a sense of animality that is not real animality, that is all divided, everyone for themselves, in order to have a robot with programming from humans to serve humans come and teach them how to be what actual animals already are, generally speaking, when really the film is supposed to be an allegory for human beings growing above our ideological add-ons, the things that we have done to erase and suppress our original programming, is exhausting. It doesn't quite work as an overarching metaphor. It would be better if it were just about human beings, but I know the original book is the baseline for this, and I'm glad the author's getting the royalties from the film or the sale. Good for him. But the movie messes with all of these core elements that are supposed to be negotiated in tandem or used in tandem to get a better sense of ourselves. So it gives a wrong-headed sense of what nature is like. Nature is not that sort of Hobbesian version where everyone is just cutthroat all the time. There's cruelty, there's hardship, and there's also some really surprising and interesting moments of support and symbiotic relationships are key to the animal kingdom as well. You don't need an artificial manifestation of humanity to come in and teach nature how to be nature. We need humanity to do that for one another. We need to just focus on ourselves. So it doesn't work for me as a piece, but I want to highlight the difference in terms of the Iron Giant does focus on humans. And it also has a robot that actually does have to overcome its programming, which is not what Roz does. Roz does not overcome her programming, even though I'm, again, gendering them in a different way. Roz expands upon the parameters of the initial objectives, which are to help support, provide for the requests that are given to it. The only thing that really Roz does differently, well, no, even then, Fink teaches her to understand that the obligation that Roz has to Brightbill goes far beyond just putting down the egg. In order to repair the damage that Roz has done, Roz has a set of missions that need to be completed, and that is exactly what happens here. And then at the end, Roz's heart grows 3 sizes in one day, etc. Iron Giant is about a machine of war. It is a weapon, and it has to learn that it doesn't have to act like a weapon just because it has that capacity in it, which again is a different kind of magic fairy tale logic. You'd have to really think about the sentience involved, but the key is that the Iron Giant being placed in the human realm allows for human characters to be messy and flawed and have their own problems and have their own tensions and have like government intervention. You have the idea of negative forces in our society more overtly named as being a problem and as being a cause of war and a cause of trauma. In a film like The Wild Robot, that is safely tucked to one side. Animals get to manifest the cruelty that human beings have ascribed to nature wrongly as being the only facet of nature. And there's that huge difference. So The Iron Giant's just a much more mature film in the sense that it actually allows us to talk about human systems sometimes being really awful. This film safely puts that aside. Which is why Chris Sanders' other project, because Chris Sanders is the director and writer of Wild Robot, is also doing a remake of his Lilo and Stitch from 2002. Disney's been doing this for a while, these sort of live-action, more highly refined animated versions of films. But Lilo and Stitch also has a monster. This time it is a non-human animality, but it's doing essentially the same thing as the Iron Giant. It is a weapon of war. And it's also this cute little fuzzy mess of a pet for this found family. Well, not really found family, there's just a differently shaped family. And that too, though, is about human beings as well. And so it has human beings interacting with this non-human sentience, this sort of animality that also has this weaponized programming into it. And this critter Stitch needs to learn to grow above the original programming. And that's what's going to happen to the 2025 version. It's just going to be a new telling of the same story in a higher digital capacity. But those stories, Stitch and the Iron Giant, both have work to do to overcome a very rigid set of programming that is limited. The Wild Robot bothers me because it imagines or reimagines nature into something, a preconceived notion that a lot of people have of nature when they want to justify their own cruel conduct as human beings, to have the human robot go in, not really grow above their own programming, just extend from their original programming to lecture nature, or not lecture, but to educate, to teach nature how to be nature, as if nature needs a lesson in how to be nature better. So it's a really weird skewing of the whole concept, because the Wild Robot doesn't really need to grow that much, not nearly as much as in Lilo and Stitch and the Iron Giant. And the world around it, unlike the original books, is artificially created in such a way that allows us to deflect from the real lessons we need. We really do need to be more mature and more upfront with ourselves about what's actually causing division. Stories like this leave the viewer with a misrepresentation of what is natural so that humans can come and correct it directly or through our creations. And I don't think that's the lesson that's really quite valuable or useful for this era. So again, feel-good film about found family. All the animals come together. They learn not to be Hobbesian, as if they ever needed to. And that creates this feel-good moment for this family. It's weird too. There's tension running through this film, and I want to thank FrostyBite667 on a Reddit forum for helping articulate this issue, because Brightbill is a goose, but not all Canadian goose. And there's something that Frosty Bites really lays out perfectly. Brightbill is much more of a barnacle goose. And so Brightbill represents a sort of hybridization of species that probably will happen with the changing of environmental spaces in the coming world. But it's a key difference, really key difference, because in the film, one of the major plot points comes from Longneck observing that if Roz hadn't killed the rest of Brightbill's family, Brightbill would have been the runt of the litter and would not have been given the attention that needed to survive, so Brightbill probably would have died. And so in some bitter twist of irony, it's actually kind of a good thing for Brightbill as an individual that Roz killed the rest of Brightbill's family by accident and then took them on. But this background of this being this sort of barnacle Canadian goose hybrid never really comes up, and so it's also tied into the notion of the runt. It's weird. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a sort of Easter egg for people to realize that Brightbill's not really a Canadian goose at all like the rest, but it also speaks to just this lazy erasure of actual animality in order to make a kind of point for itself. So again, fine film for a lot of people, feel-good film, but when the main argument for your work requires you to modify what actual animality is like so that you can create false tension, when it requires you to pretend that you've done something that you haven't really done, in terms of the main character having a growth moment that doesn't really exist, it's not really that much of a stretch for the character to be doing what they're doing for the most of this film. It takes away a lot of the tension, and this film doesn't usefully fill it with coherent, thoughtful commentary about the world ahead, because it's part of a trend of not really engaging with the problems that we have as humans and the systems that are causing a lot of the trauma that lies ahead. So it was a painful film in some ways to watch. I mean, meh in the moment, but I see this and I think this is the kind of safe content that we are capable of producing right now, because we don't really want to talk about the big issues, so we're just going to talk about how you can create cool found families in the wake of so much destruction, because we can't have the bigger conversations. We're afraid to. We just don't like talking about human beings in the same way, and animation in particular gives us an out, because who doesn't want to just watch funny creatures anyway instead of humans? So there is something strange going on with this trope, and I want to again highlight that the book is a lot stronger on a lot of these themes. So when we come down to it, it's not a bad film for entertainment, but it also is a film that speaks to a modification of this trope and the classic tension between our holy triumvirate that I don't think is playing out very well right now. We're much more interested in found family narratives than thinking about the broader systems, or maybe that's just the kind of film that gets greenlit at this juncture. It's just a discouraging trend, let's put it that way, because I think we do need to lean into stories that tell us a little bit more about the tensions that currently exist between our artificial intelligences, our artificial systems, ourselves, and the rest of the natural world. I just don't know where that storytelling is going to come from right now. It just certainly didn't come for me from The Wild Robot. So hopefully there's something in there for you to chew over in your own writing practice. But more importantly, at the beginning, as I mentioned, you need to have a little bit of grace for yourself. We're not going to be perfect. We are going to screw up a lot. We're living in a world where people have different approaches to screwing up. Some approaches to screwing up are really intense. They are afraid to grow. They're afraid to renegotiate social contracts. They're afraid to negotiate sense of identity for themselves, for their countries, for their ethnic groupings, anything to that extent, because there is so much fear that if you give even an inch, if you start to have discussion, dissent, holding things in tension, you're going to lose everything. And as long as we are caught between that zero-sum thinking and more proactive thinking, either on an individual level or on a social level, we are not going to be as flexible as we need to be for the problems ahead. So we'll keep talking about science fiction in lots of different forms, but do try to push your own writing praxis in the direction of greater tension, and your own human praxis in the role of greater tension. That gives you permission to forgive yourself for just being a little bit messy in really terrible times. Okay, that's it for me today. Thank you very much, as always, for liking and following. If you do, and whatever you're reading, whatever you're enjoying, I hope that you have a wonderful, restful end of the year. We should be touching base one more time with another magazine review, so I'll see you then. Cheers.